1066, William wins at Hastings. England falls. The end. That's the story you were taught. It's also, at best, half true, because 5 years after Hastings, an English rebel was still holding a fortress against the King of England, and the King of England was losing. His name was Hereward. History doesn't even agree on how he died. It doesn't agree on how his story ends at all. The conquest wasn't a single battle. It was a 5-year war, fought province by province, forest by forest, marsh by marsh. Hastings gave William a crown. It didn't give him a country. So, how did a fight that supposedly ended in one afternoon in October 1066 drag on for 5 more years? The reality is darker and far more contested than any film about 1066 would dare to admit. William spent years burning, starving, and garrisoning his way across England because large parts of England simply refused to accept that the fight was over. 5 years, not 5 hours. 5 years of broken treaties, burned villages, and a king who had already shown, in the north, exactly how far he was prepared to go to make an example of anyone still resisting. Hereward the Wake was the last of them to fall. Almost. To understand Hereward, you need to understand what England actually looked like after Hastings. William was crowned on Christmas Day, 1066, at Westminster Abbey. That's the part everyone remembers. What gets left out is that for years afterward, his grip on the country was nowhere near secure. English earls submitted, then rebelled, then submitted again. Castles went up not as monuments, but as garrisons, built to hold down a hostile population. The old Anglo-Saxon system of local defense, the feared a levy of free men, raised shire by shire when the king called, had effectively been broken at Hastings, along with most of the English nobility who would have led it. What replaced organized national resistance was something smaller, more scattered, and far more desperate. In 1069, matters escalated. Rebellion broke out in the north. The King of Denmark, Sweden II, sent a fleet to support it. This was not some foreign adventure. Denmark had its own historic claim on the English throne. This was a rival dynasty testing its chances. William's answer was the harrying of the north. Over the winter of 1069 to 1070, Norman forces swept through Yorkshire and the surrounding shires. Crops burned, livestock slaughtered, villages razed. The chronicler Orderic Vitalis, writing decades later, put the death toll at 100,000. Modern historians treat that specific figure with real caution. Orderic wasn't there, and he had his own reasons for telling the story that starkly. But nobody seriously disputes that the harrying was real, deliberate, and severe enough to leave parts of the north recorded as waste in the Domesday Book 17 years afterward. This wasn't just conquest, it was a demonstration. What kind of resistance could possibly survive that? William held a hostile country by a small number of methods, repeated relentlessly, year after year. 1. Castles permanent, garrisoned strongpoints planted in every town that mattered. 2. Land redistribution. English lords replaced wholesale with Norman ones who owed everything to William personally. 3. Targeted brutality used precisely enough in the right places to make resistance look pointless before it even started. Ely was about to test whether that formula actually held up everywhere. Into this world, in the middle of 1067, walked a man most of England had never heard of. Hereward's origins are, and this matter's genuinely uncertain. He was almost certainly from Lincolnshire, probably born around 1035, into a family with land near the town of Bourne. Beyond that, the sources disagree. Some accounts make him the son of a minor nobleman named Leofric of Bourne. Later, more dubious traditions try to attach him to England's most famous noble household, the family of Leofric of Mercia and Lady Godiva, a claim modern historians treat as invention, almost certainly constructed generations later to inflate his prestige. What's more plausible is that he was Anglo-Danish, connected by blood to the abbot of Peterborough, a man named Brand. So, who was Hereward before any of this? According to the Gesta Hereward, the single most detailed source on his life, and also the least reliable, he was exiled around the age of 18. Not by the Normans, by his own father, or by King Edward the Confessor, for disruptive, unruly conduct. This was years before the conquest even happened. He spent that exile abroad. Scotland, Ireland, Cornwall, according to legend, though historians treat those specific tales as largely fiction, closer to folk tale than fact. What's better attested is the next part. By the early 1060s, Hereward was in Flanders, working as a mercenary for Count Baldwin V. Around 1063, he's said to have joined an expedition led by Baldwin's son, Robert the Frisian, against rebellious territory near the Scheldt estuary, a campaign that modern historians, working from independent Flemish sources, consider broadly consistent with what we know actually happened there. He fought in tournaments at Cambrai. He built a reputation as a soldier worth hiring, not a name worth ignoring. At some point in this period, he married a noblewoman named Torfida from a wealthy family in Saint-Omer. He built a soldier's life abroad while England fell apart without him. He was still there when Hastings happened. He wasn't at the battle. He wasn't even in the country. Hereward returned to England in the autumn of 1067, shortly after the death of his patron, Count Baldwin. What he found waiting for him is the part of the story that turns an exile into a rebel. According to the Gesta, his family's lands had been seized. His brother had been killed. His brother's head, the account claims, had been placed on a spike at the gate of the family home. Is that literal or literary? The record can't say for certain. The Gesta was written decades later, patched together from oral memory where the original text had rotted away. But the broader picture, dispossession, violence, a family destroyed by the new regime, fits everything else we know about Norman land seizure in this period. Whether the spike is fact or embellishment, the loss underneath it was real. What happened next is one of the few episodes independently confirmed outside the Gesta. Hereward found the men responsible celebrating at a drunken feast, mocking the English. He killed them. The sources put the number at around 15, with the help of a single companion. A separate, independent chronicle, the Hyde Chronicle, corroborates a related killing. Hereward is recorded as killing a Norman named Frederick, brother-in-law to one of William's own barons, William de Warenne. Historians consider this one of the few hard facts sitting inside an otherwise murky legend. This wasn't just a family's revenge. This was the moment a dispossessed exile became something else entirely. A problem. He traveled to Peterborough Abbey, where his uncle Brand was abbot, and was formally knighted there, a symbolic act, arming himself for what came next. Then he vanished back to Flanders for a period, letting the situation cool before returning to England for good. By 1069 or early 1070, Hereward had joined forces with the Danish fleet camped in the Fens, the same force King Sweyn had sent to back the Northern Rebellion. Together, in 1070, they struck Peterborough Abbey, his own uncle's abbey, the one place that had knighted him. Thorold was not a typical choice of abbot. Contemporary chroniclers describe him as a very stern man, a former head of Malmesbury Abbey, run so harshly that William reportedly moved him specifically because Peterborough needed someone who behaved, in the king's own words, more like a knight than a churchman. He arrived with an armed retinue of knights at his back, not the household you'd expect around a new abbot. To Hereward and the Danes camped nearby, he looked less like a man of God and more like an occupying garrison with a crozier. Why attack it? The stated justification, recorded in the sources, was to save the abbey's treasures from this newly installed Norman abbot to keep English wealth out of Norman hands, even if that meant seizing it by force from an English institution first. It's a morally messy episode, and this channel isn't going to pretend otherwise. Some accounts claim Hereward later had a change of heart and returned what was looted. Others, including the Peterborough Chronicle, written at the very abbey he raided, simply say the Danes sailed home with the treasure and never gave it back. This matters because it shows something the brave Englishman versus foreign invader version of the story leaves out entirely. Resistance to the Normans wasn't a clean story of English unity against a common enemy. It was messier than that. English institutions got caught in the crossfire of English resistance. Then the Danes did what allied foreign powers often do. King Sweyn made peace with William and sailed home. Hereward's biggest source of manpower disappeared almost overnight. What do you do when your only real army sails away? Most rebels at that point would have gone home too. Hereward didn't. He held his position at Ely, deep in the Fens, and something remarkable happened. He started attracting the last serious resistance left in England. By the start of 1071, his camp included Morcar, the dispossessed former Earl of Northumbria. It included Ethelwine, the exiled Bishop of Durham. Some sources place Earl Waltheof there too, though his exact role is disputed. He was, by most accounts, a man who drifted in and out of rebellion against William more than once. Morcar was no minor figure. Until the mid-1060s, he had ruled one of England's great heir earldoms, Northumbria, before rebellion and later submission cost him nearly everything he had. Ethelwine had once held one of the English Church's most senior sees. Both men had already lost everything once under the new order. Both had, by 1071, very little left to lose by trying again. This was no longer one outlaw's grudge. This was the last gathering point for organized English resistance to the Norman Conquest. Here's why the location mattered. The Isle of Ely wasn't an island the way we'd picture one today. It was higher, drier ground rising out of a vast, waterlogged wilderness of reed beds, bog, and slow-moving channels, the Fens, one of the most difficult landscapes in England to move an army through. Heavy cavalry, the single greatest Norman military advantage, was close to useless in a swamp. Hereward and his men knew the causeways, the safe paths, the places where the ground would swallow a war horse whole. The Normans didn't. This is what made Hereward genuinely dangerous. Not just his fighting ability, his understanding that terrain could cancel out an empire's advantage in steel and cavalry if you used it right. The Gestar claims he went further than knowing the ground. It says he disguised himself, at different points, as a fisherman and as a potter, moving through Norman-held territory to gather intelligence on troop movements before slipping back into Ely unseen. Whether every detail of that is literal fact or later storytelling flourish, historians can't fully separate one from the other. But the pattern underneath it fits everything else known about this campaign. This wasn't fought through pitched battles the English couldn't win. It was fought through ambush, disguise, and knowledge the enemy simply didn't have. William's first attempts to deal with the rebellion, sent under trusted commanders, failed. That's not a small detail. This was a king who had just finished crushing the north with total, systematic brutality. And a rebel army in a swamp was holding him off. That same spring, in April of 1071, a separate rebellion collapsed elsewhere in England. Edwin, Earl of Mercia, was betrayed by his own men while trying to reach Scotland, and was killed. It's worth pausing on that, because it establishes a pattern. Betrayal wasn't going to be unique to what happened at Ely a few months later. By this stage of the conquest, betrayal was becoming the way this war kept ending, not through open battle, but through someone deciding, from the inside, that the fight was already lost. What finally moves a king to leave his throne and take the field in person? A rebellion nothing else can finish. So in the summer of 1071, William came himself. He assembled an army and a fleet for a coordinated attack, land and water together, aimed at cracking Ely open. So how do you lay siege to a swamp? The Norman answer was brute engineering. According to the two most detailed sources, the Gesta Herewardi and the Liber Eliensis, William's forces built a causeway nearly a mile long across the marsh timber, packed earth, whatever it took to get an army onto dry ground. It failed. The weight of armored men and horses, the sources claim, caused it to sink into the bog, taking soldiers down with it. How much of that is literal engineering catastrophe, and how much is later storytelling embellishment, the sources don't fully agree. But the underlying fact isn't in dispute. The direct assault on Ely failed, and failed badly enough that William had to try something else. The direct assault failed for reasons the sources broadly agree on. 1. The ground itself swallowed armored men whole. 2. Hereward's men knew paths the Normans simply didn't. 3. The Isle was never going to be taken by force alone, only by information. The same sources add a stranger detail. Facing a rebellion that wouldn't break through pressure, the Normans allegedly brought in a witch to curse the defenders from a wooden tower overlooking the marsh. Hereward's men set fire to the structure. It collapsed with her inside it. Take that literally, or don't. Historians generally read it as medieval shorthand for psychological warfare rather than sober fact. But it tells you something real. By this point, the siege of Ely had become the kind of story people told to make sense of how badly the Normans were struggling against one Englishman in a swamp. Direct assault had failed. Intimidation, real or embellished, had failed too. So the Normans changed tactics entirely. They turned to the monks. The Isle of Ely was, at its core, the site of a wealthy abbey, and the monks who lived there had their own institution to protect, quite separate from the rebels sheltering around them. According to the sources, the Normans, likely under a knight named Belesius, approached the monks and secured a secret route through the marsh. Bribed, threatened, or simply pragmatic about a rebellion they judged doomed anyway. Does it matter, in the end, which one it was? The sources don't settle that definitively. What they agree on is the outcome. The monks showed the Normans a hidden causeway. The Isle's defenses, built on geography no army could cross, collapsed because of a route no army needed to fight for. The route the monks are said to have revealed ran near a crossing point, still known today as Aldrich, on the southern approach to the Isle. An earthwork on rising ground nearby, now called Belsar's Hill after the knight some sources credit with leading the final push, still marks roughly where that crossing sat. It's one of the rare points in this story where legend and landscape still line up exactly. This matters because it reframes the whole siege. Ely didn't fall to superior Norman force. It fell to information. When the Normans came through, the Isle broke quickly. Morcar was captured. He would spend the rest of his life imprisoned. Most of the rebel camp was rounded up, pardoned into submission or scattered. Hereward wasn't among them. 5 years of resistance. One king personally forced into the field twice, and at the moment it finally ended. The man William had spent all that time and money trying to catch simply wasn't there to be caught. Every one of the earliest surviving sources agrees on one specific point. Hereward escaped into the wild fenland with a group of his followers, disappearing back into the same landscape that had protected him for months. The Normans had won the siege. They still hadn't caught the man, and that's where the reliable historical record as opposed to legend effectively stops. So what if Ely had held? It's worth asking seriously, not as fantasy, but as a real historical question, because the answer says something about how close this actually was. Realistically, Hereward was never going to march out of the Fens and unseat William the Conqueror. By 1071, the Normans already had a network of castles across most of England, garrisoning towns and controlling the roads. The marsh gave Hereward a shield. It never gave him a sword long enough to reach London. But total victory was never the only alternative to total defeat. Here's the more interesting question. What if the resistance at Ely had simply held out longer, long enough to become the anchor point for a bigger, better coordinated push? Denmark is the key here. King Sween's fleet had already shown up once, in 1069, backing rebellion in the north with real force. the Danish crown had a genuine historical claim on the English throne. This wasn't a foreign country doing England a favor. It was a rival dynasty testing an opening. England had changed hands to a Scandinavian king before, within living memory, when Canute took the throne in 1016. A longer, better-supplied rebellion at Ely, one that didn't lose its Danish allies to a premature peace deal, isn't an unreasonable thing to imagine tipping into a second, larger Scandinavian intervention. There's also the question of what a longer, costlier siege would have done to William's own position. Kings who can't pacify their new territory don't stay unchallenged kings for long, not in Normandy, where William still had rivals watching for weakness, and not in England, where every earl who'd already submitted was watching to see whether submission had actually been the smart move. A slower, more expensive victory at Ely wouldn't just have cost William time. It would have cost him the appearance of inevitability that made the rest of the conquest run as smoothly as it did. What would that longer fight have produced? Almost certainly not a full English restoration. More likely, something closer to a negotiated partition of divided England, the kind the country had already lived through under the old Danelaw arrangement generations earlier. A weakened Norman crown forced to bargain with surviving English and Danish power centers instead of ruling through near total dispossession. Is that a stretch? Perhaps. But it's a smaller stretch than pretending Ely could only ever have ended one way. That world looks very different from the one we actually got. Anglo-Saxon landholding might have survived in pockets rather than being wiped out almost completely within 20 years, the way it was. The English aristocracy might have persisted as a class instead of being replaced almost wholesale by a new French-speaking elite. The entire trajectory of English law, English land tenure, even the shape of the English language, all of it shaped by just how completely the Norman elite replaced the Anglo-Saxon one, might have looked less French and more simply English. It's worth remembering that total dispossession wasn't quite universal, even in the England we actually got. A small number of English landholders, men who cooperated early, or who proved useful enough to keep on held on to some property under the new regime. That gives some sense of scale for what a longer, stronger resistance might have forced William toward more broadly. Not English rule restored, but English survival negotiated, on a scale far larger than the handful of exceptions history actually left us. None of that happened, but it's worth remembering it wasn't impossible. It just needed a few more months, a few more allies, and a couple of monks who chose differently. Here's where Hereward becomes more interesting than most conquerors, not less. We don't actually know how his story ends. Not really. One tradition, the Gesta Hereward, says he eventually tried to negotiate with William, got provoked into a fight, was captured, and was then freed by his own men during a prisoner transfer. It claims his old jailer eventually persuaded the king to pardon him, and that Hereward lived out the rest of his life at peace, remarried to a noblewoman named Alftruda after his first wife entered a convent. A different, independent source, the 12th century Histoire des Anglais, written by Geoffrey Gaimard, tells a harder story. In this version, Hereward lived on as an outlaw in the Fens for years, and was ambushed and killed by Norman knights just as he was on the verge of making peace. There's a third possibility historians take seriously too, that Hereward got no pardon and no dramatic death, that he simply vanished into exile, the same fate that swallowed a huge number of prominent Englishmen after the conquest. Their names quietly dropped from the record because the winners had stopped needing to write about them. 3 different endings. No consensus. So which version is true? Nobody can say, and that's not a gap in this script. That's the actual state of the historical evidence, and it deserves to be said plainly. This channel doesn't manufacture certainty where the sources don't offer any. It's worth knowing where this story even comes from, because the answer says a great deal about how fragile it is. The Gesta Hereward was written roughly 40 to 60 years after the rebellion, most likely at Ely itself, commissioned by a bishop named Hervé. Its author claims to be working from an earlier, damaged Old English account written by a man named Leofric, a priest said to have fought alongside Hereward personally, and to have set his account down not long after Hereward's own death. Where that original text was torn or missing, the later author admits to filling the gaps with oral tradition already circulating in the Fens. Even the most detailed source on Hereward's life is, by its own author's admission, part memory, part reconstruction, and part story people were already telling before anyone wrote a word of it down. Even the name The Wake is contested. It doesn't appear attached to Hereward until more than 300 years after he lived, in a late medieval version of the Peterborough Chronicle. One theory holds it comes from an Old English word meaning roughly the watchful or the alert, fitting for a man whose entire military strategy was built on knowing ground his enemy didn't. The other theory is less flattering to the legend. That it comes from the Wake family, the Norman-descended lords who ended up owning Hereward's old lands at Bourne generations later, and who by the 15th century were claiming direct descent from him. Attaching Hereward's name and reputation to their own family tree wasn't sentiment. It was a legitimizing strategy, tying a Norman-era landholding to an English folk hero to make their claim to the estate look older and more rightful than it was. Real watchfulness, or a later invention to justify a land grab. By the 15th century, that same family was going further still, claiming Hereward himself as the son of Leofric, Earl of Mercia, and Lady Godiva, attaching him not just to their bloodline, but to the single most famous noble household in pre-conquest England. Modern historians reject that lineage outright, but it shows how useful Hereward's name had become, 400 years on, to people who had nothing to do with why he actually fought. Even his heroism, in other words, might have been partly repurposed by the very kind of Norman-descended aristocracy he spent 5 years fighting. And here's the detail that ties the whole thing together. The clearest, most reliable piece of documentary evidence that Hereward existed at all doesn't come from an English chronicle or from folklore. It comes from the Domesday Book, the Norman Crown's own Great Land Survey, completed in 1086, 15 years after Ely fell. Buried in its entries for Lincolnshire is a tenant named Hereward, holding land from Peterborough Abbey. The Conqueror's own bureaucracy is what preserves the rebels' paper trail. William's regime, in the act of cataloguing everything it now owned, accidentally certified that the man who fought it had existed at all. Hereward stayed a minor, half-forgotten figure for most of English history after that. That changed in the Victorian era, when a wave of interest in authentic Anglo-Saxon national identity, the same cultural mood that produced Walter Scott's Ivanhoe, turned him into something closer to a symbol. Charles Kingsley's novel, published in the 1860s, cast Hereward as the last true Englishman standing against a foreign Norman yoke, and that romantic version is largely the one that survived into popular memory. It's worth noticing the irony. A figure whose real story is defined by uncertainty became, 800 years later, a vehicle for a very confident political idea about English identity, one the actual 11th century evidence can't fully support. Some historians even suspect that fragments of the Hereward legend the outlaw hiding in difficult terrain, the intimate knowledge of landscape used against a more powerful enemy, the band of loyal followers, the disguises fed into a much more famous English legend that came later. Robin Hood. Nobody can prove a direct line between an 11th century Fenland rebel and a story that wouldn't take its familiar shape for another 2 or 3 centuries. But the resemblance isn't a coincidence historians simply ignore, and it says something about which stories England chose to keep. Not the story of a king who won, the story of the men who wouldn't stop making him work for it, and the Fens still remember him in smaller ways. There's a long-distance footpath between Peterborough and Ely called the Hereward Way, tracing roughly the ground he once knew better than any Norman ever could. For decades, a regional radio station carried his name. A widely grown variety of bread-making wheat, bred in the 20th century, was named after him. To a strange, quiet kind of immortality. for a man the historical record can't even confirm the death of. None of it proves the legend. All of it proves the legend mattered, and still matters, to the people living on the exact ground where it happened. 1066 gave William a crown. It took him 5 more years, a burn north, a betrayed monastery, and a swamp he couldn't cross by force to actually finish the job. And even then, the one man who beat him at Ely simply walked into the marsh and was never definitively seen again. That's not the ending your school textbook gave you. It's the one the evidence actually supports. A king who won the crown in an afternoon and then spent 5 years finding out that winning a crown and winning a country were never the same thing. So pardoned nobleman, ambushed outlaw, or a man who just vanished into exile like so many others before him. Which ending do you think really happened to Hereward?